Hello, and welcome to the Homegrown Fuels podcast, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America. I'm your host, Sue Retka-Schill, a longtime biofuels journalist. There are so many good stories out there about the early days of the ethanol movement that ought to be recorded before they're lost. Writing a book takes a lot of time and resources, but I love talking to people and people love telling their story. So the idea for this podcast was born. Thanks to BBI International and Ethanol Producer Magazine for producing this podcast. Our guest today is Bob Thornberg, founder of SweetPro, manufacturing feeds with distillers' grains and a condensed distillers' solubles product, trademarked probiotin. More recently, Bob founded Food First to manufacture fermented prebiotic health foods. Bob got his start fermenting ethanol in the mid-1980s at Walhalla, North Dakota, which is not far from where I live. Bob, welcome to the Homegrown Fuels podcast. Tell me, Bob, how did you get from working in broadcast at WCCO in Minneapolis to Walhalla, North Dakota?
That's a question I get periodically, and it is kind of an interesting journey, circuitous journey for sure. But there is a good thread to it. I was in the news department, and it was in the days I was specializing in energy and agriculture. And on the energy side, we were dealing with Arab oil embargoes and just a tumultuous time in energy independence and all sorts of concerns in that regard. And then agriculture, there was the first Russian-American grain sale. And I remember being on the grain exchange floor when that first happened to Russian sales. And it was just almost chaotic. And so there was some very formative kinds of things going on at that time. But again, with the focus being specializing in energy issues and agricultural issues, suddenly here comes ethanol, which combines the two. And so it was the energy independence factor of it that I was most struck by. And I decided at the time that I wanted to get, instead of reporting on something, I wanted to participate in it. And so I decided to make a career change and got into the business side of the renewable area and first started out with solar, but then they took on an ethanol component at the same time. And so that's how I got focused on the ethanol side. And it was just a natural fit because I'd been covering so many things early on in the early days of ethanol production and back in the Berkeley Bedell days of, how do you get this into gasoline supplies? So it really goes back to the very beginning.
Cool. Yeah, and Walhalla was one of those first of the, I think it was started at a 10 million gallon a year plant, but it was started by farmers, wasn't it? And this was when they started moving beyond the farm scale, trying to get a larger scale and some efficiency of scale, as I understand.
Yeah, it really was. The early days, the idea was that there would be a small-scale ethanol plant on every farm in order to be sure that you had the fuel to, put the crop in. And the irony there is that was when everybody had kind of transitioned over to diesel tractors, and now you're making ethanol, and you can't use it in those tractors anyway. So yeah, there were some dislocations in all of that, but the real intensity and the interest was farm scale and essentially how to use your corn better and more effectively. And so it was the corn producers that were pushing it. But really, if you didn't have livestock, you couldn't do a small-scale plant very effectively anyway because you had to use the byproducts right there. And so some of those evolutions of the very early days and the early interest in using up extra corn and being energy independent and those kinds of things, the economy of scale, kind of set in pretty quickly that you had to be a larger facility and you had to dehydrate the ethanol. In the early days, we only went to 190 proof with a simple still, and then you had to, upgrade it. And that's just when molecular sieves were even being invented. And so there was a lot of change and graduation into larger plants pretty quickly. And at the time, 10 million gallons was not an unusually big plant, but it certainly wasn't, nowadays it would be a tiny plant. Almost.
Right.
So things really change. I mean, the first plants that I was dealing with, originally I ended up with Conklin Company because they had a program called Harvest Fuel, Alcohol, and Feed Plant. And it was presented as, if you can integrate this into a livestock operation and use the feed directly, the feed was extremely valuable. And the alcohol was more a co-product and almost a byproduct-oriented approach at that time. And so it's been interesting. It sure makes you learn a lot of the nuance in both the ethanol side of things and the fuel industry that has to go into, and then the feed byproducts and using them, and how to use them most opportunistically, which really has been mostly cattle, because the ruminant animal does better on that fibrous distiller's grain than did hogs or poultry at the time. So
Yeah. Now I understand why you knew you might want to start something like SweetPro. But tell me first, before we get to that, the plant at Walhalla was started as barley plant, wasn't it? What was that about?
Well, it really was. It was a pretty dramatic effort, and it was to be the world's largest barley to ethanol plant. And it was identified as, 10 million gallons nominally. It had the potential to go to 14. And the idea was to utilize barley more effectively. There was virtually no corn grown up in the upper Red River Valley at the time. And so the barley growers were focused and helpful in it. And that was the big push to be the world's largest barley to ethanol plant.
Cool. Yeah, what people may not know is that we're located in extreme northeastern North Dakota. You live, about 4 miles from the Canadian border? And I live less than a half mile from the Canadian border.
Yes.
So yeah, there is a lot more corn here now, but back in the mid 80s, it was barley country. Definitely barley country. I understand barley plants have to be properly designed, and if they aren't, barley is a difficult grain to deal with. Would you agree, and can you explain why?
Yeah, when you look at the basics of the grain, if corn is about 70% starch, barley is only about 55% starch. So if you're in the ethanol industry, you want the starch in order to have the conversion to sugars and make alcohol, because that's your primary objective. Well, if all of a sudden your feedstock is 55% starch, well, that means the balance is going to be a higher percentage of fiber and the like. And so your recovery, in those days, it was about 18 pounds of feed coming off of a bushel of corn, but it was 22 pounds of feed coming off of a bushel of barley. And so the plant had to be designed differently. It had to have a higher centrifuge capacity. It had to handle solids more so than did a corn plant, because there was proportionately more solids to deal with. And then the other irony in that is that, while there was limited awareness of what distillers' grains even were, there was, corn was the mainstay. And so people knew about corn distillers' dried grains, but they knew nothing about barley distillers' dried grains. And so we were often confused with brewer's grain. And so it was even more difficult to try to get into how do you market this distiller's feed when everybody's, unfamiliar with its, with the differences, and confusing it with brewer's grains. So there were a lot of things that were early learning curve that we had to deal with. And then ironically, I ended up switching the plant from barley to corn in the
Oh, wow.
early days.
Where'd you
Yeah.
get your corn from then?
Well, it was a curious thing. We ended up, at the time, the graders and the people from the elevators and everything dealt so little in corn that they didn't know how to grade it. And I had to recruit some graders from Nebraska, it turns out, to come and teach the guys how to grade corn so we could even take it in. But corn was starting to move a little bit farther north. But still, it was coming from some distance. At that time, Cargill was sourcing everything for the plant and then taking the distillers' feeds away. And so I didn't have to deal with the specifics of that so much as, just the mechanics of getting it into the process.
All right. So it was difficult economic times then that made you decide you wanted less to do with ethanol and more to do with what you ended up calling SweetPro. Tell me that story.
It really influenced the career decisions that I was making because, at an early time when ethanol was quite, expensive with the subsidies associated with it, it worked really well. But if all of a sudden, the price of crude oil was dropping, which was happening at that time, and the price of grain was rising, your primary cost is your grain, your primary revenue is your ethanol. And when ethanol is going down and your cost of grain is going up, well, you're on the wrong side of that equation. And I used to call it the scissors. I mean, you just get scissored, right, cut off at the knees. And so for me, I wanted to be in a position where a higher percentage of the plant's revenue would come from feed, because if grain is your main cost item and feed is your main sales item, well, then those ride together. But even though it wouldn't be your main item, at least if you got it as a higher percentage, it kind of insulated you from those big swings that could scissor. And it wasn't just the plant in Walhalla that got scissored that way. Any number of plants did, and periodically did over the years.
Yeah. What year was that about?
Well, that had been right in like 1988, I think, is when crude oil dropped the lowest.
Okay.
It was, it had been in the 30s, $30 a barrel, which sounds tiny now, but it dropped to 15, it dropped right in half. And so the value of all fuels was dropping, but grain had been climbing. And so it just was an impossible situation.
So what led you to start looking at, you started looking first at lick tubs, or were you doing something else with distillers grains before that?
Well, I really had to look at things from a very different vantage point than a lot of people did, because originally, even when I was dealing with farm scale ethanol and with the Conklin plant back in those days, the plants were modest to the point where, they would ferment and distill the alcohol, but they couldn't run whole mash in their distillation columns because they weren't, sophisticated enough. And so they would separate the Conklin plants would separate the liquids from the solids out of the fermenter and then just distill the liquids. Well, the solids were pretty moist then still, and most of that moisture, in that moisture was a high percentage of alcohol. So the feed coming off some of those first small scale plants were very different feed because it had alcohol in it. And it worked in amazing ways. And we were kind of trying to figure out how do you value all of that? And it gets to be difficult because the feed industry didn't have alcohol in their feed identification numbers or anything like that. And so it was just looked upon in the industry as an inefficient alcohol plant because we only recovered 2.2 gallons of alcohol per bushel. The rest of it was in the feed. Well, the feed worked wonders. And I realized that one time, if I can ever duplicate how well that feed works with the alcohol in it, we're going to have something quite dramatic and quite unique. And so it put me on a trajectory on the feed side of things. And then coming into the ethanol plant in Walhalla, I had the other problem in that, people, at that time didn't know what distillers grains even were. There weren't feedlots for cattle and there weren't any dairies to speak of. The cattle in the area were all beef cattle, so cow-calf, and they don't have feed troughs and that type of thing. And so that's what really stimulated the interest in how do I get this distiller's grain into a format that can be used for pasture animals. We didn't have the feedlots and dairies, so we had to try to go to pasture. And so then we pioneered the use of distiller's grains in a lick tub instead of using molasses. And as a result, we ended up with something that really was more complementary to that fermenting animal, that ruminant animal. They'll do better with distiller's grains than they do with sugar as the base because, the mama cows, they're grazing. They're not eating feedlot grain. They're just grazing mostly or dry lot hay. And so that was another reason why it was imperative to try to get a different orientation to how the feed was coming off the ethanol plants. And that's why I ended up specializing in using feed from ethanol plants and making lick tubs and making products that were for, pasture-based feeding. And then cattle was the first, and horses has come on real strong. We're doing real well on the horse side of things as well, and goats, and any herbivore really does well with this kind of feed.
Okay, so you started also, if I remember you telling me your story, you worked with USDA on condensed distiller solubles to beef up the plain distiller's grains?
Well, the USDA work that we did, we were trying to figure out a way to use ingredients that were lower starch, but had a higher feed recovery potential. And so if, like I was mentioning with barley has, a higher percentage of feed than does corn, because corn, as far as post-fermentation, the recovery off of a bushel of corn, like I said, was 18 pounds, 22 pounds off of a lighter bushel of barley, 52-pound bushel. And so it was just looking at feedstocks very differently because I was trying to get my revenue as a higher percentage of feed. And so I was willing to look at fermenting lower cost but lower starch feedstocks. And that really hasn't been done and still isn't done very much. But we took that example in our organization actually to an extreme where any fermenting that we do now, we are oriented to making as little alcohol as possible. And the probiotin plant in Walhalla now that you referenced, we just grow yeast on the media that we cook and ferment, and we grow yeast on it instead of anaerobically fermenting and making alcohol because it would be too small to justify, the dewatering equipment and the distilling equipment and everything to be in the alcohol side. We're just completely on the feed side in that regard.
Okay. So back in the early days, distiller's grains there were people that knew it was good for feed, but there were an awful lot of places that actually just landfilled it, I understand. Is that
It
true?
was, yeah, it was really unusual in the early days, and I remember it well. Uh, the ethanol was the big motivator, and a lot of the people coming into the industry were from the fuel side of things and didn't even understand grain very well and didn't understand feed hardly at all. And so feed was what you had to get rid of in order to make your alcohol. And I say that because that's exactly how it was. It was, how do we get rid of this stuff that's not just now it's a co-product and a very valuable one, but at the time it was hardly even a byproduct. It was almost a waste product. And so they found, well, animals can eat it. Oh, how about that? Which sounds kind of funny nowadays, but it was almost that way in the early days. And so to get rid of this stuff, alcohol producers were looking at, feeding it as best they could. And some of the people that lived in the vicinity of these plants and had livestock did real well because they were they were being given some of this feed in order to get rid of it. And then a curious thing happened, as if you're doing it as a wet product in the early days, it made sense because then you didn't have to have dryers. But in the early days, I remember instances where, people with a small scale alcohol plant and everything, and they were, talking to the farmers and finding out this feed was pretty good. And the cattle producer, the dairyman would take it and then they'd get a little bucky saying, well, I don't know, maybe I don't want this quite so much, can you dry it or whatever? And, well, then the small alcohol producer was stuck and they had to try to dry it. Well, that's a whole different set of conditions and more difficult to do economically on a small scale. And those who did go to the effort to put drying equipment in, once they would get it in, and I remember one particular incident, the reading about it out east, was they finally got their dryer in because the farmers weren't going to take it wet. And then when they got their dryers in, they said, well, that wet stuff was pretty good. We'll take it that way after all. And so, well, that doesn't help your economics and your, and all of that. And so the learning curve was that basic, though, is kind of the point in it, and understanding those dynamics and how that shifts and the economies of scale get in there. But there was some wonderful, legislative approaches, and the blending of 10% into gasoline just made enormous sense because, people weren't going to convert vehicles over to just straight alcohol. It was impractical. And I can say that from firsthand experience. I converted a car over to alcohol thinking that's what you're going to need to do and that's what you should do. And it was pretty naive at the time, but I was driving around an old Buick that I drilled out the jets in the carburetor so that I could even use any alcohol. It was grossly inefficient, but I could drive on 190 proof alcohol and did.
Oh, it was hydrous ethanol even. Okay.
Yeah.
That's cool.
And at the time, I used to do something just for a demonstration that was kind of interesting, is I'd have some distilled water in a jug with me, and people could smell something was very different out of that vehicle. And I'd say, watch this. And I'd take the gallon of distilled water and I'd pour it in the gas tank and I would drive off. And all I was doing was diluting the 190 proof alcohol to about 170 or something like that. It still could run. And I could still drive, but it looked pretty miraculous because people were saying, how in the world, So anyway, it was just one of those little sidelight things in the very early days, and getting attention was something that became increasingly necessary to get your point across about, some of these unusual new fuels and new techniques and everything. They look pretty silly now in retrospect when you've got this spectacular industry that's grown up really within our lifetime and is just hugely dramatic and been wonderful for rural America and just strengthening farm economies and, improving air quality and improving octane, and all the reasons that people were interested in it were dead right, continue to be, and I'm just a fuel ethanol advocate from day one.
From day one, well, from the beginning of this industry. Well, this has been very interesting, Bob, and I think we've about come to the tail end of our conversation here. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me about all this, and I think your car was a wonderful idea. I wish more people would play with that kind of stuff. That's great.
You bet. A pretty unusual set of circumstances, but we were trying all sorts of things.
Okay. Thank you, Bob, and thank you all for listening. Thanks to Ethanol Producer Magazine for sponsoring this episode of the Homegrown Fuels podcast. Ethanol Producer Magazine is the #1 source for ethanol industry news, trends, and statistics. Through the print magazine and website, ethanolproducer.com, the editorial team delivers daily news and industry features to an audience of producers, service providers, and vendors. If you would like to sponsor a future episode of Homegrown Fuels, contact service@bbinternational.com. And if you have a comment on an episode or know of a story that ought to be shared, email homegrownfuels@bbinternational.com. This podcast was recorded and edited by Danielle Pekarski, Content Manager at BBI International, and I'm your host, Sue Retka-Schill. Thank you for listening. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with another episode of Homegrown Fuels, sharing stories of ethanol's emergence in rural America.